Alright, welcome to our video series of Introductory to Biology for Spoon Feed Me. In this course we've split the intro to biology, and it's quite a diverse topic, and there's a lot of different fields we're going to delve into. We're going to look at biochemistry. So our first videos will be on how the chemistry of life works, particularly looking at biological macromolecules, nucleic acids, lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, some of the things you might recognize from hearing in fad diets and stuff. But we're going to look at that more in that more rigorous scientific context. And then we'll also look at stuff like energetics and how cells use and transfer energy. Then we'll move on to cell biology, so we'll be looking at cell structure and function, some of the important biochemical. We'll delve a bit back into biochemistry, looking at how the structure of a cell is involved in this, looking at some of the important biochemical flows within the cell, especially photosynthesis and respiration. Then we'll do a bit of an introduction to molecular biology, and we'll look at some of the basic genetics and some of the basics of genetics and how DNA works and some of the basics of that, and that will build towards our last sort of section, which is on evolution, phylogeny, and diversity. So it's slowly we're building up in scope from the tiny molecules which make up life, bigger and bigger, up into cells, up into whole cellular machinery, and then up into whole organisms, and starting to look at evolution and the change of organisms over time. So slowly our scope should be getting bigger through the course. We might sometimes go backwards a bit just to clarify things or delve into things in a bit more depth with a bit more perspective, but generally our scope is widening the whole time. So we'll dive straight into our first topic, which is our first topic in biochemistry, and that's the chemical environment of life. So it's quite important to consider what sort of chemical environment life exists in, because it has profound impact on the chemical reactions that occur in life and the type of molecules we see occurring in living organisms and what their role in living organisms. So our first objective is to identify what is life's chemical environment, and our second one is how does it affect its chemistry. The first dot point is pretty easy. Life's chemical environment is aqueous, so pretty much that just means it's concerned with water. Everything's surrounded by or dissolved in or interacting with water. Water is the main feature of biological chemistry. Water is pretty much everywhere. There are a few situations where water is excluded completely, but in most cases water is all around and interacting in many ways with the biological molecules, and we'll see specific examples in later videos of how the cell utilizes the presence of water, the chemistry of water, for very specific, very useful processes. But first we'll look at the basic chemistry of water and have a look at what sort of molecule it's like. So most people know the chemical formula for water is H2O. So there's two hydrogen atoms bonded to one oxygen atom, and when you draw it out, it looks somewhat like this. You have your oxygen atom up the top, and then the two hydrogen atoms are coming off in what's called a bent configuration, and the angle between them is about 105 degrees. And in fact, sorry, there was an ant there. In fact, most of its useful chemistry comes from the fact that oxygen is electronegative, which means it attracts electrons with a much greater degree, electrons being negatively charged. And hydrogen is it's relative to each other, but hydrogen is electropositive, pretty electropositive, so they give up electrons fairly easily. So what this means is this bent molecule of water actually gets a slight charge attached to it. So we can see that water attracts more electrons to it because it's more electropositive. It steals away the electrons a bit more, and so it becomes, this delta here means slight charge. So it's not a full charge, it's not a full negative charge, but it becomes slightly charged because the electrons, which are negatively charged, hang around the oxygen more of the time. So because they're there more of the time, the oxygen is slightly more negatively charged, and the hydrogens, because they're getting less of the electron density, less of the time the electrons spend around them, the hydrogens are actually slightly positive. So this gives us what's called a dipole. So we get an electron, two poles, and we have two chemical charges on each side of the cell. So it's called a dipole because you get two poles, a positive and negative pole. And so this is called a polar molecule, and water is a ubiquitous polar molecule. And it's very important. Its polar nature is very important in a lot of biological chemistry and a lot of its chemical interactions. And when we start talking about its propensity to store heat and its high heat capacity, which means it takes a lot of heat to warm it up by 1 degree, takes a lot of heat energy. And when we start talking about surface adhesion, surface tension, adhesion, cohesion of water, when we talk about the physical properties of water, it's generally due to this polar nature, and they form quite strong hydrogen bonds, because these slightly positive hydrogens are attracted to the slightly negative oxygens of adjacent water molecules, and those dipole interactions with the positive attracting to the negative, because we know positive attracts to negative, they form what's called hydrogen bonds. So they're quite strong dipole interactions within water, and that gives water a lot of its physical characteristics, such as the ability to form into a drop or something. But its polar nature is most notable in biology because polar molecules interact with other polar molecules because of this hydrogen bonding. They form hydrogen bonds and they mix together. So you see polar molecules being soluble in other polar molecules. For example, sugars, carbohydrates such as glucose, they have a lot of oxygens and hydrogens and carbons, and this mix of different atoms and different electronegativities makes them quite polar. And because they're quite polar, they readily dissolve in water. Whereas non-polar molecules, things without this sort of dipole, and you'll get practice identifying these sort of things. Non-polar molecules do not form bonds, hydrogen bonds, so these sort of interactions with polar molecules, and so in fact they don't mix. And there's more complex reasons to why they don't mix, but essentially they don't interact well with these polar molecules, especially water. And so they don't really mix with water. And an example of this is water and oil. You can see they're kept quite separate because oil is non-polar, or what's called hydrophobic. So phobic and hydro, water, phobic, afraid, separate from. So hydrophobic molecules don't mix with water, such as this hexane. So this hexane isn't exactly what you'd see in oil, but it's a close analog of what you'd see in things like oils and fats, which don't really dissolve in water. And you see that's just a long hydrocarbon chain, so it's just mostly carbons and carbons with hydrogens attached. And because of its symmetrical nature and the fact that carbon and hydrogen aren't that dissimilar in electronegativities, not nearly as dissimilar as oxygen and oxygen and hydrogen, and the fact that it's symmetrical nature, all the dipoles cancel out, and so you're left with this molecule with no polar nature, no dipoles, and so it can't form any hydrogen bonds with water, and so it doesn't really mix with the water. So this is a hydrophobic molecule, and something like sugar, which is polar. Or ethanol, which is ethanol is CH2, CH3, and then OH. So ethanol here, which is alcohol, it has this OH group attached to the carbon, so that this is like one of the oxygen and one of the H's from water. So this group here is actually quite polar. So ethanol here is it will dissolve in water because it'll form these hydrogen bonds, and so it's in fact called hydrophilic. So hydrophilic molecules are those which dissolve in water, whereas hydrophobic are those which don't dissolve in water, don't interact with water very well, don't interface with water. And so, as I said, that's things like oils and fats and water. You see hydrophobic oil separate separately from water. So if we added ethanol to this, if we added glucose to this, a highly polar molecule, we'd see the glucose dissolving in the water, the sugar dissolving in the water, but it wouldn't interact very well with the oil. So that's just a bit of an intro into the sort of aqueous environment of life. In the next video, we're going to start moving on, looking at macromolecules, and we're going to start with carbohydrates.